This episode of Onward to Victory is proudly presented by our good friends at West Coast Screen Printing and Embroidery at wcscreens.com. You've heard their name for years now, and for good reason. If you have needs with screen printing, embroidery, customized promotional items for your company, organization, or more, head over to wcscreens.com and get with my friend Tony and the rest of his team. They have nationwide shipping, wholesale pricing, and exemplary customer service. Not only are they big supporters of this podcast, but just like you, they are diehard fans of the Fighting Irish. Score a touchdown with wcscreens.com. And on with the show. For this Memorial Day commemoration episode, we remember Notre Dame halfback Jack Chevigny. The native-born Hoosier, Chevigny was a Rockne-era ball player who, it could be argued, scored perhaps one of the most memorable touchdowns in Notre Dame football history. After a rather interesting career as a football head coach, Chevigny was ultimately commissioned an officer in the United States Marine Corps. While serving in Japan during World War II, he was killed in action on the shores of Iwo Jima. Today we illuminate the career and the last full measure paid by First Lieutenant Jack Chevigny. So buckle up those chin straps, Irish fans. This is Onward to Victory. Hello all and welcome to Onward to Victory, a Notre Dame football podcast. My name is Alex Painter and welcome all to episode 96 of this humble show. As a podcast, we are getting very close to the official 5-year anniversary of the show, so I'd like to thank everyone for being here. Whether you have been here the entire time, since the beginning, this is your first episode, or anywhere in between. I have a nice offering today, appropriate for the approaching Memorial Day holiday. But really, I'll just tell you the truth, this one's going to be good to listen to at basically any point of the year. But first, how about a quick 30-second commercial for the previous episode? Notre Dame football history has been marked with coaches with long, successful tenures. Names like Rockne, Leahy, Parsegian, and Holtz are listed among the most prolific college coaches in history. But what about the guys who only served at the helm of the program for a single season? Believe it or not, there have been 7 of those guys too. Though their time at the charge of the program may have been short, some of these men hold incredible significance for Notre Dame football. In fact, I'd go as far as to say some of their contributions were just as important as some of those more famous coaches who came after them. If you're interested in learning more about the guys who served just 1 year as head coach at Notre Dame, tune in to episode number 95. And got to throw in some thank yous, a sincere acknowledgement here to the show's financial sponsors. We call them the Consensus All-Americans. These folks have either contributed significantly in the past or are currently donating to the show's efforts, and they are Dr. Jeremy Scarlett of Whitefish Bay, Wisconsin, Brad Glazier of Williamsburg, Indiana, author, writer, and Notre Dame alum Will Fuller of Warren, Ohio, Andy Nickel, also a Notre Dame alum of South Bend, Indiana, and Michael Finan of Rutherford, New Jersey. If you yourself would like to chip in and make the prestigious muster roll to Consensus All-Americans, please visit paypal.me/onwardtovictory or patreon.com/onwardtovictory podcast for a monthly donation. Thank you all. And of course, I'd be remiss not to mention this show is powered by West Coast Screen Printing and Embroidery at wcscreens.com. So please jump over to them with any needs, whether it be screen printing, embroidery, or again, if you need customized promotional items for an event or your company or your organization, whatever it might be. WCScreens.com. Also, this podcast is now sponsored by Augie's Locker Room in South Bend, Indiana, the premier shop for Notre Dame memorabilia and gifts. No trip to campus is complete without a stop at my good pal Augie's. One-of-a-kind items, gifts, relics. He's even dedicating some space for museum-like exhibits. So they're at a new location now. It's 1733 North Ironwood Drive, which is just a stone's throw from the old location. But it is the same Augie that you know and love, Augie's Locker Room. Now, this isn't new news per se, but it is of significance, great significance at that, just in case you missed it. Last month, the caskets of legendary Notre Dame head coach Knute Rockne and his wife Bonnie, as well as other family members, were exhumed from their original burial location at Highland Cemetery in South Bend and reinterred on campus at Cedar Grove Cemetery. Why, you may ask? Why is actually a question that many people asked. Coach has been buried across town for over 9 decades. Sadly, the primary reason is so his final resting place would be, for perhaps lack of a better phrase, respected in perpetuity. I was a frequent visitor of Rockne's former burial site. The common complaint from Rockne's grandchildren and others was the litter around the grave. And that's something I can kind of agree with. Sometimes there was no litter, other times the ground was full of litter around Rockne's final resting place. I can agree on this front. It wasn't uncommon to find beer bottles, snuffed out cigars, other bits of litter at the site. The corners of the headstone, you probably noticed if you were there, had small chips in them where souvenir hunters had taken parts of the headstone home with them. And I will say, full disclosure, I'm certainly someone who participates in leaving a penny on a headstone from time to time, but that's a little different than leaving trash. The family, which 7 grandchildren were present at the reinterment, can rest easy, I guess, now knowing that the graves will be honored and respected perhaps a bit more in their new home. The University of Notre Dame released the following statement, quote, "At the request of the Rockne family, the University of Notre Dame was honored to assist with the disinterment of the remains of football player, coach, and athletic director Knute Rockne and several Rockne family members from Highland Cemetery in South Bend, and their subsequent burial at Cedar Grove Cemetery on campus. The prayers of the church were offered for the repose of their souls upon their reinterment. Rockne's funeral mass was celebrated on April 4th, 1931, at the university's Sacred Heart Church, now the Basilica of the Sacred Heart," end quote. I've actually been asked multiple times since this news broke last month, why wasn't Rockne buried on campus to begin with? Well, a good bit of perspective can be found in the winter issue, 2005-2006, of Notre Dame magazine, in an article written by Ed Cohen. Quote, "Why was Rockne, who was only 43, not buried in Cedar Grove Cemetery at the south end of campus? According to Louis A. McGann, whose grandfather, Louis W. McGann, headed the McGann Funeral Home in South Bend, which handled Rockne's burial, the decision was made by Rockne's widow, Bonnie. She wanted to be sure that the grave would be cared for in perpetuity, and in those days, the early 1930s, Cedar Grove didn't offer that level of service. It was the responsibility of families to cut the grass and otherwise maintain the grave or else pay a maintenance fee. At Highland Cemetery, the maintenance was included in the price of the plots. Louis A. McGann said Mrs. Rockne actually bought the plot from his grandfather, who owned several in the Graceland section of the cemetery, where most of the Catholics were buried. Bonnie Rockne was Catholic, and her husband was converted in 1925, end quote. So there you have it. And if you were to take everything at face value, Coach Rockne is now buried in Cedar Grove Cemetery on campus for the exact same reasons he was buried in Highland Cemetery off campus in 1931. And that is so that the final resting place of the coach is respected and well maintained. So I guess in some respects, even though folks look at reinterments a little bit differently, there's some consistency in where he was buried and why, even though now it's two places 90 years apart. Appropriately, though, now, Coach Rockne will now be buried on the campus that he graduated from, and just a stone's throw from the stadium, otherwise known as the house that Rockne built. All right, so now let's move on to Memorial Day. The first time the holiday was formally recognized was in May of 1868. This is kind of the commonly accepted origin story of the holiday. And as you may have guessed, the observance has close ties to the American Civil War. At the time, it was called Decoration Day. Truthfully, there are probably many in the listening audience who may actually remember it being called Decoration Day because it wasn't widely known, for lack of a better phrase here, as Memorial Day until a federal law to observe the day was passed to observe again the holiday nationally in 1967. So there you go. There has long been observances of Memorial Day on Notre Dame's campus, too. I went into the archives and found a couple. In 1883, the local Grand Army of the Republic post in South Bend, the GAR was a Union veterans organization, visited Cedar Grove Cemetery on campus. Yes, the one we were just talking about, to visit and decorate the graves of Union soldiers buried there. This one is per the June 5th, 1886 issue of the school paper. Quote, "The Hoynes Light Guards took part in the celebration in connection with Decoration Day at South Bend on Monday last. The press of the city commented most favorably upon the appearance of our boys and their skillful maneuvers." Speaking of the various organizations that took part in the procession, the South Bend Tribune says, quote, "Prominent among these were the Hoynes Light Guards of Notre Dame University, accompanied by Colonel Hoynes himself. The company, dressed in gray uniform, attracted general attention for the soldierly bearing of its members. The precision with which they maneuvered was credible to the soldiers who had fought and drilled and fought for 4 long years, and these were the loudest in the praises showered upon the soldier students of Notre Dame." End quote. I will just kind of be frank here. The Hoynes Light Guards probably deserve their own episode for this show at some point. But I got to give a quick shout out for this particular episode to Dr. Jeremy Scarlett, who is an ardent supporter of this show. He had brought up a book some time ago that at the time I hadn't read, but I since have, and it has played heavily in the research and writing of this episode. And the book is called The Last Chalk Line, The Life and Times of Jack Chevigny. The book was written by Jeff Walker, and it is a very, very good read, and illuminated the life of a ball player whose name is likely not wholly unfamiliar, but I will be the first to admit I didn't know as much about Jack than I should have. Now moving on to our episode's primary focus, the life, career, and the sacrifice of Jack Chevigny. Let's start at the beginning. John Edward Chevigny was born on August 14th, 1906, in a place called Dyer, Indiana. A quick note for the geography buffs in the listening audience, and I know there's several of you. Dyer is in Lake County, whose county seat is Gary, Indiana. So this is the part of the state of Indiana that is commonly known as the region. Dyer sits just on the Indiana-Illinois state line and is south of the city of Hammond. So we are talking basically a stone's throw from the city of Chicago, but on the Indiana side. Oftentimes that side of Indiana is kind of considered is kind of greater Chicagoland. But he was born to Julius and Roseanne Chevigny. And a really quick note on the spelling and pronunciation. Chevigny is spelled Chevigny and pronounced with a silent G, Chevigny. His father, Julius, was a physician, and that is really what Jack assumed he would also eventually become, as did Julius himself. But Jack went to parochial school during his elementary years, and then he eventually ended up at Hammond High School, where he was a standout athlete. Probably not much of a surprise. But at this time in his life, he was typically called Johnny. he was certainly a little more than cavalier about his studies than, say, his father, Julius, would have liked. In fact, in his senior high school yearbook at Hammond High, his senior comment was, quote, "I'll have my lesson tomorrow," end quote. At any rate, Jack was recruited to play football at Notre Dame by the great coach Knute Rockne. And he also intended on studying pre-med while he was at the university. Again, this was kind of the family, that was kind of his upbringing. And I'll just kind of say it plain. A lot of the standout football players at Notre Dame at this time were first, second generation immigrants or came from lower socioeconomic backgrounds. Chevigny would have represented something a little bit different on the football team. His father, again, was very successful, and there was high expectations for him. Jack arrived on campus in the fall of 1924. In 1925, I found where he was going out for the reserve Notre Dame football team. In fact, one of his first games of his Notre Dame career was back in his old stomping grounds in a game against the East Chicago Elks Club in September. Jack actually punched in the first touchdown of the eventual 18-0 Irish victory. In a November 1925 issue of The Times, which is the daily newspaper in Munster, Indiana, they waxed poetic about Jack towards the end of the season. The reserve team made a trip to Kenosha, Wisconsin, and promptly defeated the semi-professional Kenosha Tigers. The paper wrote that, quote, Chevigny, the fleetback who wore the numeral 2, was a constant source of worry for the Kenosha defense. He tore off several long gains and performed like a polished player. The former Hammond star made the only touchdown of the game to win a victory for the Notre Dame aggregation, end quote. Jack was a fleet-of-foot type of halfback that Coach Rockne loved, even perhaps a bit undersized at 5'7"-ish and 170-ish pounds. This was 1925 after all, so Coach Rockne would have won a national championship the previous year, 1924, with a very undersized backfield and a very undersized line. That was, of course, the Four Horsemen and the Seven Mules. After all, size was not a litmus test for the legendary coach. But Jack would make a penchant for scoring critical touchdowns. At any rate, Jack's time at Notre Dame was off to a really good start on the Gridiron, but, and this is a big but, his grades were rather poor. Actually, they were described by Walker, his biographer, as abysmal. Subsequently, he was actually suspended from Notre Dame and had to take 4 summer school courses in 1926 just to be reinstated and deemed eligible for football. And it's not that Jack wasn't a smart guy. It was just clear that he was not jibing very well with his intended major at the time. So he decided that the pre-med track was just not for him. So he switched to law instead. But it was during the 1926 season, Jack, now reinstated to the football team, was the third-string halfback and saw action somewhat sparingly. But it was the following season in 1927 that he really came into his own and became an impact player on both sides of the ball for the Irish. The team went 7-1-1. The last game of the season was a 7-6 win over USC at Soldier Field in Chicago in front of 115,000 people. That's a lot. But here's what the Notre Dame Football Review had to say about Jack's 1927 season. Quote, Chev's long end runs and off-tackle smashes won the plaudits of everyone who had the opportunity to see this colorful halfback in action. Possessed of snaky hips, lightning speed, and ability to tackle savagely, the Chev was forever worrying the opponents. With no regard for life or limb, he made a shoestring tackle to stop jousting in the Minnesota game and prevented a sure touchdown. His defensive play was a feature of every game, and his long gallops in the Detroit, and Georgia Tech games will serve as fuel for the Hot Stove League this winter, end quote. Moving to 1929 now, which would have been Jack's final season, his senior year. Now, interestingly, This season was something of a blip in the career of Coach Rockne. One might even say it was a black eye. The season didn't go particularly well. The team went 5-4, and there were some fairly bad losses in there, including a 27-7 loss against Carnegie Tech at home in November. This one is significant because it was the final game played at Cartier Field, and the loss was the first for the Irish at Cartier Field in 23 years. Imagine that one. Notre Dame in the present day has put together some really long and impressive home winning streaks. Don't forget that the Irish had actually not lost at Cartier Field at home. They lost in the final game in 1928, but the previous one had been 1905. Actually, if memory serves, it might have been against Wabash College. But at any rate, they also lost to USC, Georgia Tech, and Wisconsin. So these were some of the major opponents on the 1928 slate, and they kind of dropped all those games. But in the midst of a frustrating season, there was one game that Coach Rockne was determined not to lose. And that was the November 10th, 1928 game against Army at Yankee Stadium. The storied rivalry between the programs was somehow about to get even better. With Notre Dame down 6-0 at the half, Rockne decided he needed to inject some pep into his boys. So rather than chew their asses out for what could have been a lackluster half, he decided he'd actually pull at their heartstrings a bit. Remind them a bit about the program's pedigree. His halftime speech would eventually be forever immortalized in the 1940 film, Knute Rockne All-American. You've probably heard it, but here it goes once more. Quote, "I guess we can't just expect to win them all. I'm going to tell you something that I've kept to myself for years. None of you ever knew George Gipp. It was long before your time. But you know what a tradition he is at Notre Dame. And the last thing he said to me, Rock, he said, sometime when the team is up against it and the breaks are beating the boys, tell them to go out there with all they got and win just one for the Gipper. I don't know where I'll be then, Rock, he said, but I'll know about it, and I'll be happy." End quote. Now, whether this conversation actually happened or not, that's up for debate. But at this point, though, the men are fired up. They kind of stormed out of the locker room and put on a show in the second half. 2 second-half touchdowns. And, of course, one by our guy, Jack Chevigny. Reputedly, when he crossed the goal line to tie the ball game, he shouted, "That's one for the Gipper," which forever cemented his name in Notre Dame lore, to say the least. But another incredibly dramatic play by Johnny One Play O'Brien gave the Irish a 12-6 lead, a margin they'd eventually win by. By the way, go back and check out episode 65 for more on One Play O'Brien. My pal Andy Nickel writes very eloquently about O'Brien, by the way. The win over Army salvaged the 1928 season, and Chevigny's touchdown, as well as O'Brien's, have entered in the pantheon again of the most significant touchdowns in program history. Chevigny stayed on for the next 3 years, actually, and helped the program as an assistant coach from 1929 through 1931. So that means he was on staff during the sudden, traumatic death of Coach Rockne. And he would have provided new head coach Hunk Anderson, who was coincidentally George Gipp's best pal at Notre Dame, some assistance during that 1931 season. He also received his law degree from Notre Dame in 1931 as well. And then, of course, to backtrack just a shade, 1929 and 1930 were not only Coach Rockne's swan song, but also a pair of national championship seasons. And moving forward fairly quickly, Jack joined the ranks of the burgeoning NFL as head coach of the Chicago Cardinals in 1932. Now, be mindful, in 1932, Jack's only 26, but this is a nod to the respect he commanded in the coaching profession. His season coaching the Cardinals in 1932 is kind of a story in its own right, but we'll leave it at that he moved on to St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas, after a 2-6-2 season with the Cardinals. Jack experienced great success at St. Edward's in, again, Austin, Texas in 1933, and he won the Texas Conference Championship with a 5-1 record and a 7-2 overall record. So he parlayed that season into a 3-year stint as head coach of the Texas Longhorns from 1934 through 1936. Speaking candidly, his tenure there wasn't wildly successful. He logged a 13-14-3 overall record. But what is notable about his time spent at Texas was that during his first season there, again 1934, his Longhorns went to South Bend and dealt his alma mater a loss at home. It was a close game, 7-6, and the Irish were now under the direction of former Four Horseman Elmer Layden. Look at all these connections. But in this game, the Irish were actually favored by as much as 30 points, according to some sports writers. After the game had ended, Chevigny reportedly went back to his bench, put his head in his hands, and just repeatedly kept saying, "I can't believe it. I can't believe it. I can't believe it." And I'm sure a great deal of that was the fact that he had taken a team that was such heavy underdogs and had pulled out all the stops for a close win. That was probably A. But B, what you got to know about Jack Chevigny was he was fiercely loyal to Notre Dame. And so it probably stung him a little bit. I mean, after all, the guy had been part of national championship teams and had coached national championship teams, and he expected probably nothing short of excellence out of his alma mater. And again, I'm sure it was a personal achievement, but he probably still felt saddened by the fact his team had beaten Notre Dame. But anyways, one Chevigny legend is attached to this game, and it was said that he was given a fountain pen after the game that said, quote, "To Jack Chevigny, a Notre Dame boy who beat Notre Dame." More on that pen here after a bit. But the completely unexpected win against his alma mater would have been the high water mark of his time at Texas. After a 7-2-1 debut season as head coach of the Longhorns, his next two seasons were a 6-12-1 mark, including just 2-10 in conference play. So he ultimately stepped down after the 1936 season. His coaching days were effectively over, but Jack, who was again a trained lawyer, was appointed Deputy Attorney General of Texas, and he also worked in the oil industry in the state as well. So moving forward to December 7th, 1941, a day which we remember in history class, which will live in infamy when the Japanese attacked the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and the United States was thusly drawn into the Second World War. Jack tried to enlist in the Army early on, but an old knee injury he sustained at Notre Dame prevented him from joining the service. However, just a couple years later, 1943, the now 36-year-old Jack Chevigny was drafted into the U.S. Army. Jack, who had become a de facto Texan over the course of the previous decade, was to report to Fort Benjamin Harrison, back home in Indiana. He was inducted as a private in the Army and quickly found that the conscripted Army life was really no good for him. He was much older than most of the draftees. Also, according to his biographer Walker, quote, "The Army quickly demonstrated that it hadn't much use for an aging prima donna Notre Dame football legend. Peeling potatoes and saluting second lieutenants were persistent reminders to Jack that he held no distinction in a mass of indifference," end quote. But hey, give some props to Jack. He worked all of his political connections, made some new ones, in an effort to get out of the Army. Not out of the service, mind you, but Jack wanted to be a Marine. His work paid off. After a few months in the Army, he was transferred to the United States Marine Corps and commissioned a first lieutenant in the 27th Marine Regiment. Not only that, he was also appointed head coach of the Camp Lejeune football team, and they were called the Leathernecks at the time. He led the team to a 6-0-1 record in the fall of 1943. In January of 1944, Chev and the rest of the division reported to Camp Pendleton in California, and then eventually to Hawaii to prepare and train for one of the frontal assaults planned on the island Iwo Jima. Jack and the rest of the 27th Marine Regiment would take part of the first wave of the attack. And just like their compatriots who had landed on the Normandy beach about 8 months earlier, a high mortality rate was expected of those who hit the beach initially. Some of Jack's final letters home reflected what his biographer Walker called a, quote, spider-like fear of his finality creeping into his daily thoughts, end quote. Jack's role was to serve as a liaison between the initial regiments landing on Iwo Jima by radio to help coordinate communication and the assault itself. He was essentially tasked with kind of manning communication between those different zones on the beach and this other waves that were coming in after the initial wave. But the 27th Marines would land on the beach known as Red 2. Imagine starting this kind of mission, looking around at your pals that you'd spent years with, and having a rather firm and even morose understanding that most of you would probably not make it home. Once Chev and the other men jumped out of their LCM, which was the landing craft mechanized boat, their goal was to immediately find shelter and move inland. But immediately after stepping onto the shore, the Marines faced a withering fire, and they quickly found that digging foxholes on the beach proved next to impossible. For it wasn't just sand, it was the composition of the beach was both sand and ash, and one Marine compared it to trying to dig a foxhole in a silo of grain. But soon the beach became overcrowded with the stuck Marines, and the supporting naval guns had fallen silent because they didn't want to risk hitting their own men on the beach. So that withering fire I mentioned a moment ago was not being countered by anything on the water. After the battle, the U.S. forces found that Japanese plans had indicated coordinates for their heavy artillery to fire on where they expected the Marines to gather. They were incredibly effective at predicting the approach of the Marines, sadly. Jack and a handful of other Marines had found cover in a 6-foot crater which had been carved out of the beach by a large American naval shell. And despite the carnage that was going on all around them, again, the fire was withering, and there are many accounts of the Battle of Iwo Jima that just really, I didn't even feel comfortable sharing with on this podcast. It's really tough to read because these Marines suffered greatly, and Iwo Jima was a pivotal step, a pivotal first step even in bringing the country of Japan to its knees eventually, right? But despite all of the carnage and all of the death and all of the destruction and all of the confusion and all of the noise around on the beach, Jack seemed like he was calm and he was in control. He was collected, and he, most importantly perhaps, was dedicated to his task of helping coordinate the assault. But however, sadly, Jack Chevigny and the other men who were taking refuge in that makeshift foxhole were killed instantly when a Japanese artillery piece had struck the crater. Jack paid the last full measure in what would ultimately be an Allied victory at the Battle of Iwo Jima. Legend has it that when the Japanese surrendered sometime after Iwo Jima, according to a 2014 article from ESPN.com written by Steve Wolf, the pen that we mentioned earlier, here's the legend. A Japanese envoy was about to sign the surrender document, this is for Japanese surrender, aboard the U.S. Missouri, when an American envoy noticed that he was writing with a fountain pen with an English language inscription. It read, quote, "To a Notre Dame boy who beat Notre Dame." Why, that must have been the pen given to Jack Chevigny after Texas beat Notre Dame, then taken off his body at Iwo Jima. The Japanese gave the pen back, and it was reinscribed, quote, "To Jack Chevigny, a Notre Dame boy who gave his life for his country in the spirit of old Notre Dame," end quote. Though the story is likely fabricated, it is just that, a really good story. But it is a reflection of just how people felt about Jack Chevigny as a Notre Dame football star, as a coach, as a Marine, serving in one of the most pivotal moments of the entire war, and having the care to make sure that his legacy lived on even to see the surrender of the Japanese. Jack was buried on Iwo Jima, but was eventually moved to Hawaii in 1949, where he rests to this day. And I'll be right back with show wrap. Oh man, what a hell of a good story, and I hope you really appreciated that and enjoyed it. That is the legend of former Notre Dame football player, coach, and Marine Jack Chevigny. I got to thank once more Dr. Jeremy Scarlett. He had emailed me, this has probably been a couple of years at this point, saying like, "Alex, you kind of got to read this book." And that was the Walker book, The Last Chalk Line, The Life and Times of Jack Chevigny. And it was a really illuminating read. Chevigny led an incredibly interesting and varied life, and glad to be able to shine maybe some light on it here for the listening audience. And like I said, I do hope you enjoyed it. And frankly, I got a little bit nostalgic because if you've been around for a long time, or if you've listened to the show's catalog, the very first episode, which was released about 5 years ago here in a couple weeks or a few weeks, was about Angelo Bertelli, who was a Notre Dame Heisman Trophy winner in 1943, and he also served at Iwo Jima, and he also was engaged in combat on the beach. Now, fortunately for Bertelli, he actually got out with his life, which so many of those at Iwo Jima did not. But the very first episode of this very show, which was released back in June of 2019, was called A Heisman at Iwo Jima, and it was about Angelo Bertelli. So, I don't know, it kind of felt a little bit full circle, and it was really fun to put together, and it kind of hit me in the feels because, again, the show's been around for 5 years and nearing episode 100, and here we go. It's cool to be able to make connections even after all these years with two completely different stories that are so intimately connected because both subjects were very close to the University of Notre Dame and its football program. But anyways, I better sign off here. I hope you enjoyed this, and I really want to thank the folks who listen and also who sponsor the show, who support the show, who share the show's existence. It is because of you all that almost 5 years in, the show continues to thrive and grow and continues to gain a listenership. So I'd like to thank all the Consensus All-Americans, of course, and like to thank our show sponsors, WCScreens.com, West Coast Screen Printing and Embroidery, as well as Augie's Locker Room in South Bend. If you enjoyed this show and you want to hear more, man, it's all free. It's all, whoever you listen to podcasts, or wherever you listen to podcasts through, I should say, you're going to find the show, and eventually this show will become the largest, most accessible, free source of Notre Dame football history. and maybe even eventually down the line, the University of Notre Dame history as well. So still got some big personal news to share that will come out here in the next month or so. Something that I've been working on for a long time is coming to a close, and I'm excited to share it with you all. If you've been listening to the show, you probably know what I'm hinting at. That will be shared here soon, but I will sign off for now. Again, thank you all. You could be anywhere in the world, but you're here with me, and appreciate you tuning in. So this has been Onward to Victory, a Notre Dame football podcast. And in kindness, I am your host, Alex Painter. And as always, go Irish.